Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the Gospels in the New Testament, studying the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we are coming upon the some fishermen following Jesus, and this is Jesus calling some of his will be disciples, and then he'll declare them apostles here later on. But basically some fishermen that he calls to be his disciples, and they follow him. And we're going to look at this. Actually, I'm going to pull from all three areas a little bit of Mark, but we're going to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke for this one. And so we see in Matthew's account, some of these are titled the first disciples, and it says one day Jesus was just walking along the shore, and he called out to Simon, also called Peter and Andrew. They're throwing nets, and so we see this, and we know, but because we're reading this in chronological order, we know that Peter and Andrew had already previously dealt with Jesus, right? And they had left John to follow Jesus. So when he was ready, so they left John, and it looks like what happened here, from what we can tell, it looks like they followed Jesus for a little while, but then end up returning to Capernaum and fishing. Perhaps they returned. During it looks like they returned during the first part of Jesus' early ministry, and then went back to fishing. So followed him for a little while, and then went back to fishing. And then we see James and John, and this James here is easily to distinguish because it's not the same James as we see in the New Testament, other James that are mentioned in the New Testament. And the reason we know this one is distinguishable is because he's always mentioned with John. It's always James and John because they're brothers. And so we see that. And so when Jesus called them, they knew what type of men he was, and who it was that was calling him. Because a lot of times we get this idea, and honestly it's kind of, we teach it in Bible class, and we teach it especially when we're kids. And the idea is that, well, Jesus just showed up, said, hey, come follow me, and these people just followed him, not knowing who he was or any of that stuff. And I'll be honest with you, that would take great faith, but also that would be kind of silly and really be kind of dangerous, right? If we just, walked up to random guy just walked up to us, said, hey, come follow me, and we just left our work and went and did it. They understood, they knew who he was. And so we need to understand that this just wasn't some stranger coming up to these guys. They knew who Jesus was. They had been around him. They had seen him do some of his miracles. And so we know that they knew who he was, but for whatever reason, they had stopped following, or not say stopped following, but they had gone back to their fishing and wasn't involved with him in his ministry. And the end of that says of Matthew 4 says they left their father behind, indicating that following Jesus is going to require commitment to Jesus. And so they had to leave things behind. And that's the same way for us. If we're going to follow Jesus and we're going to do what he asked, then there's going to be a commitment there. And sometimes that commitment, you know, may go above things to your own family, or things that you may have had as a priority in the past, but now Jesus is the new priority. And so we see that happen. And so if you jump over to Mark, and again, I'm not going to read these, but if you jump over to Mark, it pretty much gives a very similar story of running into Peter and Andrew first, and then going down and running into James and John, and them leaving their father, Zebedee, who's mentioned there. But the one thing that Mark mentions in verse 20 is that they left their father and the hired men. So this indicates that, sometimes we will, the teaching in this isn't, and I'm not going to say it's right or wrong, but sometimes the teaching is this, well, they were just poor fishermen who, this actually indicates that they may have had actually, at least James and John may have had a lucrative business, because they had hired men. Having hired men back in that day, was harder to do. And that means you had your own business you were running. So more than likely, they may have been a little bit more lucrative. And so maybe the whole poor fisherman theory doesn't fall into place there, but they still were fishermen, which even in that day, some could be looked at as down upon a little bit as a trade there. And so, but anyways, I wanted to throw that in there. And then finally you get into Luke, and Luke's account is a lot different than Matthew and Mark's. And I don't know if it's just because maybe Luke did a little bit, deeper study into this and got the whole story, where Matthew and Mark just kind of recapped it. But Luke goes into the story, and we see the miracle that Jesus performs here. So he actually goes up to them. They'd been fishing all night, hadn't caught anything, and Jesus tells them to go and put their nets deeper, and you'll catch some fish. And it's like, Simon Peter, who, always, I relate to Simon Peter because he's always putting his foot in his mouth, or he's always kind of arguing, or doing something. He's like, we worked at this all night and didn't catch a thing, but he's like, if you say so, I'll do it. And there's a little bit of doubt there, and so they do it, and they catch all these huge fish. There's so much that they can't hardly bring them all in. And, the ship's on the verge of sinking, and then Simon Peter realizes what happened, and he follows us in and says, you know, believe me, for I'm such a sinful man. He realized who Jesus was, and the power of who Jesus was. And I mean, he's seen a little bit of it before, but he truly saw it with this miracle. I mean, he's showing to them that he has full control over nature. And so we see that remarkable miracle to them. And this is when, Jesus says in 10 here, he says, don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fisher people. Meaning, he was calling them. He had gone to them, calling them, from now on, this is what you're going to be doing. And as soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. So they get back and they follow Jesus. So the story from Luke's perspective is a little bit different. He goes into a little bit more detail, and he doesn't go into, he doesn't name all of them, but he goes into that detail there. And so we see that. And so this was the disciples' second call. We saw the first call in John 1, verses 35 through 51. And so they had gone back to fishing, for whatever reason. I don't know. It doesn't go into the detail, but I want us to see that, because we kind of get this, when you don't read it in a chronological order, then it seems like, oh, well, they just started following Jesus from year one and they stayed with him the whole time. But there was actually a gap there. I don't think it was a very long gap, but it was a short period of time there where he had gone back, and they had gone back to fishing and weren't following him. Again, we don't know 100%, but then Jesus comes and calls them to full-time ministry, to full-time follow him, and they do that. And so from that point on, they left their nets and remained with Jesus. And again, it goes back to that. For us, following Jesus, is not just acknowledging him as a savior, but we must leave our past behind. We must commit to him in the future. And so there's a lot that goes into us following Jesus. And I want to make sure that, I've kind of talked about that a lot in the last couple of weeks. We talk about how we must have belief and we must have faith, but that has to be a working faith, right? It has to be a faith that comes out, that shows there's a change of heart. There's evidence of that. You can't just be like, oh, well, I believe in Jesus and I have faith in Jesus, and I'm just going to continue living like I was before, not really making much of a change. No, it's truly changing the way that you live. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go through that, and look at a lot more of how, the type of person that Jesus calls us to be, because sometimes I think we can get that construed a little bit. And I want to make sure that we truly understand who we're being called to be, who we're supposed to be as followers of Jesus, and what that really looks like. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the idea is that, oh, well, you're a good Christian if you do certain things. You show up to church on Sunday, and you sing some songs and take communion and do that stuff, give a little bit of money. Well, then you're a good Christian. And honestly, while those things are important, to me, if you look at what the things Jesus says, those are actually the least important of part of being a Christian, right? And we're going to look at that, and some people may disagree with that, but I think actually the worship on Sunday that we do, it is important. Don't get me wrong, it is important, but I don't think it's near as important as the things that we do through the rest of the week, and the way we behave and the way we treat people through the rest of the week. So again, this is Jesus following four fishermen, Peter and Andrew and James and John, to follow him. They later become his apostles, and we'll get to that. And we see this process of them. He didn't just show up. He worked with them before. They knew who he was, and so they see that he really proved to it. We see that in Luke, that he can even control nature, and they saw who he was for sure and started following him. So again, I appreciate y'all watching these. I hope that you're getting something out of them. If you are, I ask again, that you share them. And if you hadn't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. We're trying to push this and get this out to as many people as we can, to help them be able to study the Bible in a slow manner, and in a way that, we can see every day, and grab a little bit of more knowledge every single day. Again, as always, I appreciate you watching.